Hello, dear friend. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Tonight, we're going to visit a small corner of Venice where music lives in harmony with silence, where strangers become friends through the simple act of listening, where every cup of tea holds a little magic. Let your breath flow naturally, in and out, like the gentle lapping of water against ancient stone steps. We are going to Venice, to a small corner of the world where music and memory live together in perfect, unhurried harmony. Julian Reed stepped off the water taxi as the afternoon light painted Venice in shades of amber and rose gold. The October air carried the faint salt taste of the Adriatic, mingled with something warmer, the smell of old stones that had been kissed by centuries of Mediterranean sun, the distant aroma of espresso and fresh bread from unseen cafes. His leather satchel, worn soft from years of carrying sheet music and hopes, hung loosely from his shoulder. Inside, folded carefully between the pages of his old journal, were 3 pieces of music he had carried from Dublin, compositions that had once meant everything to him, back when his life had different shapes and colors. Now they felt like pressed flowers, beautiful but fragile, holding memories he wasn't quite ready to examine in the harsh light of day. The narrow streets welcomed him with their maze-like embrace. Here, away from the crowds that gathered around San Marco, Venice revealed her more intimate self. The afternoon shadows stretched long and blue between buildings that leaned toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. Water lapped gently against the foundations of houses painted in faded ochre and peeling rose, their reflections wavering in the small canals like watercolor paintings left in the rain. Julian walked without purpose, letting his feet choose the path. This was what he had come here for, to be lost, to let the city's ancient rhythms slow his racing thoughts. The sound of his footsteps on the stone bridges created a gentle percussion, mixing with the distant calls of gondoliers and the soft splash of oars cutting through dark water. He had no particular destination in mind, which was exactly what he needed. For too many months, every day had been measured in lessons to teach, bills to pay, lawyers to call, and the careful choreography of avoiding the places where his former life still lingered. Venice, with its labyrinthine streets and timeless patience, offered him something he had almost forgotten existed: the luxury of wandering without purpose. It was the faint sound of piano music that first caught his attention, drifting through the cool air like incense. The melody was Chopin, a nocturne he recognized but hadn't heard played quite this way before. The notes seemed to float and settle, unhurried, each one given space to breathe before the next one bloomed into being. Following the music like a thread through the maze, Julian found himself in a narrow alley that he would have walked past without noticing, between a small book bindery and a shop selling handmade paper. Almost hidden by the shadows was a doorway he nearly missed. Above it, a sign weathered by decades of Venetian winters and summers read in faded gold letters, Sala di Te e Musica, Dal 1889. The music grew clearer as he approached. Through the small window, clouded with age and condensation, he could see the warm glow of old-fashioned lamps. The piano music paused, then began again, this time Debussy, played with the kind of gentle reverence that spoke of deep understanding rather than mere technical skill. Julian's hand hesitated on the worn brass handle. He had grown cautious about new places, new people, new possibilities for disappointment. But the music called to something in him that had been sleeping for months, and before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing that struck him was the warmth, not just the physical warmth of a room heated against the October evening, but something deeper. The air itself seemed to embrace him, scented with bergamot and old wood, with the faint sweetness of vanilla and the green freshness of mint leaves. It was the smell of a place where time moved differently, where urgency was an unwelcome guest. The interior of the Sala di Te e Musica was like stepping into a living memory. The walls, painted in soft cream that had aged to the color of old parchment, were lined with shelves that held an extraordinary collection. Here were volumes of sheet music that looked as though they had been touched by the hands of long-dead composers, their pages soft and fogged with age. There were books about music history, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless readers, and small curiosities, antique metronomes, miniature instruments, and photographs of musicians whose names were whispered legends. The floor was made of wide wooden planks that had been polished by decades of footsteps until they gleamed like dark honey. They creaked gently as Julian moved across them, a soft percussion that seemed to harmonize with everything else in the room. Small Persian rugs, their colors muted to dusty roses and sage greens, were scattered across the floor like islands of comfort. In one corner sat the piano that had been calling to him from the street, a Steinway grand that had clearly seen better decades, but had been maintained with loving care. Its ebony surface held the soft reflection of the room's warm lighting, and even from across the room, Julian could see that its keys had been worn smooth by countless hours of music making. The lighting came from an eclectic collection of lamps, a few crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow fragments across the ceiling, table lamps with fabric shades in warm amber and rose, and candles in glass holders that flickered gently, adding their own soft rhythm to the room's peaceful atmosphere. The effect was of being inside a jewel box, everything softly illuminated and precious. Small round tables were scattered throughout the space, each one different from the others. Some were antique wood with intricate carvings. Others were wrought iron, painted white, and topped with marble. Each table was set with fine china, teacups and saucers that looked as though they belonged in a grandmother's special collection, with delicate patterns of flowers and gold trim that caught the lamplight. Behind the counter, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had never learned to be in a hurry, was an elderly woman whose presence seemed to anchor the entire room. Her silver hair was pinned up in a style that might have been fashionable 50 years ago, and her dress, a deep burgundy with small pearl buttons, spoke of careful maintenance rather than recent purchase. She looked up as Julian entered, and her smile was like the room itself, warm, welcoming, and completely without judgment. She didn't speak immediately, but simply nodded toward the piano and then toward the tables, giving him the gift of choice without pressure. Her hands continued their work, arranging tea service on delicate china, wiping down surfaces that already gleamed, moving through rituals that had probably remained unchanged for decades. Julian chose a small table near the window, where he could watch both the room and the narrow slice of Venetian evening visible through the old glass. The chair was upholstered in worn velvet, the color of forest moss, and it embraced him with the comfort of furniture that had been chosen for human happiness rather than appearance. Without being asked, the woman brought him tea, a blend that smelled of Earl Grey with something else, something that reminded him of autumn afternoons and the safety of being warm indoors while rain pattered against windows. The cup was bone china, so thin it was almost translucent, painted with tiny violets that seemed to dance in the lamplight. As Julian sipped his tea, the room continued its gentle evening ritual. Other patrons came and went. An elderly gentleman who read a worn book of Vivaldi scores while drinking espresso. A middle-aged woman who worked quietly on what appeared to be musical transcription. A young couple who shared a pot of chamomile tea and spoke in whispers, their conversation mixing with the soft background of recorded classical music that played almost below the threshold of conscious hearing. The piano sat silent now, waiting. Julian found his eyes drawn to it repeatedly, the way one might be drawn to look at the ocean or a fireplace, some fundamental human attraction to beauty that served no practical purpose but felt essential nonetheless. The tea warmed him from the inside out, and he realized that for the first time in months, his shoulders had completely relaxed. The constant tension he had been carrying, the feeling that he needed to be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else, had melted away like sugar in warm water. Outside the window, Venice was settling into evening. The light had shifted from amber to deep blue, and the street lamps were beginning to cast their golden circles on the stone pavement. Occasionally, footsteps would echo past, the quick tap of heels on stone, the slower shuffle of tourists consulting maps, the confident stride of locals who knew these streets like the rooms of their own homes. It was the elderly gentleman who approached the piano first. He had finished his book and his espresso, and he moved toward the instrument with the careful reverence of someone approaching an altar. The woman behind the counter nodded at him with the familiarity of old friendship, and he settled onto the piano bench with a small sigh of contentment. His hands found the keys like birds returning to a favorite tree. He began with something Julian didn't recognize, perhaps an improvisation, or a piece so old it had been forgotten by everyone except musicians like this man, who carried melodies in their bones like genetic memory. The music that emerged was like nothing Julian had heard in months of teaching scales and simple songs to reluctant students. This was music that understood the weight of years, that had lived through seasons of joy and sorrow, and had somehow distilled all of that experience into something that spoke directly to the heart without needing to pass through the mind first. The notes seemed to have physical presence in the room, settling into the spaces between the shelves, curling around the lamp flames, mixing with the scent of tea and old wood and the faint saltiness that was never far away in Venice. Other conversations stopped, not from any social pressure, but because the music was too beautiful to compete with. Julian closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. It had been how long since he had heard music played this way, not as performance or lesson or professional obligation, but as pure expression, as emotional truth made audible. His own hands, resting on the small table, moved unconsciously, his fingers remembering the feel of keys beneath them, the satisfaction of bringing music to life. The old man's improvisation shifted into something Julian recognized, a Schubert piece he had learned as a student, back when music had felt like discovery rather than routine. But this performance revealed layers in the composition he had never noticed before, subtle emotional currents that flowed beneath the familiar melody like underground streams. As he listened, Julian's mind drifted to his own piano, sitting silent in the Dublin flat he had left behind. He thought of the hours he had spent at that instrument, first as a child learning to read music like a new language, then as a young man pouring his dreams into compositions he was sure would change the world, and finally, as an adult, using it to make a living, to pay bills, to maintain the life he had built with someone who was now a stranger to him. The divorce had taken many things, the house, half of everything they had accumulated, the future they had planned together. But perhaps the thing he missed most was the easy companionship of making music with someone who understood its language. His ex-wife had played violin, and their evening duets had been the highlight of their early years together. When had that stopped? When had music become just another source of tension? Another thing to schedule around work and obligations and the slow erosion of love. The Schubert piece moved through its gentle progressions, and Julian felt something inside him that had been clenched tight for months beginning to unfold. Not healing, that would take much longer, but a first tentative loosening, like the earliest buds on a tree that has survived a harsh winter. As the evening deepened, the woman behind the counter began the quiet rituals of closing. She moved with the same unhurried grace she had shown all evening, washing teacups with careful attention, wiping down surfaces that already gleamed, arranging everything for tomorrow's opening. But there was no sense of being rushed. The old man continued to play, moving now into a gentle Chopin prelude, and the remaining patrons settled deeper into their chairs, into the comfortable silence that surrounded the music like a prayer. Julian ordered another cup of tea, this time something herbal that tasted of lavender and honey, something designed to ease the transition from day to night, from consciousness to sleep. The warmth of the cup in his hands anchored him to the present moment, to this room, this evening, this unexpected gift of peace he had stumbled upon. He thought about Dublin, about the life he had left on pause while he tried to figure out what came next. The teaching position would be waiting for him when he returned, and the small flat, with its view of gray rain and endless obligations. But somehow, sitting in this room filled with music and gentle light, that future didn't feel as heavy as it had that morning. Maybe it was the music, or the tea, or simply the accumulated weight of beauty in this small space. But Julian began to remember why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for career, or security, or even companionship, but for moments like this, when sound became emotion, when harmony meant something deeper than just notes played together, when the act of listening became a form of meditation. As the old man's playing came to a natural conclusion, he looked up and caught Julian's eye. There was something in his expression, not quite an invitation, but an acknowledgement, a recognition of shared understanding. He rose from the bench with the same careful deliberation he had shown in approaching it, and moved back to his table to collect his things. The piano sat silent again, but now its silence felt expectant rather than empty. Julian found himself standing before he had made a conscious decision to do so, his body moving toward the instrument with the same inevitability of water flowing downhill. The bench was still warm from the previous player, and as Julian settled onto it, he felt the weight of all the musicians who had sat here before him. Decades of hands finding these same keys, decades of music emerging from this same wooden body, decades of evenings like this one, when strangers had become connected through the universal language of melody and harmony. His hands found the keys tentatively at first. He hadn't played for pleasure in months, hadn't played anything except scales and exercises and the simple pieces his students were learning. But the instrument responded to his touch, like a friend welcoming him home. And he began with something simple, a Bach invention he had memorized as a teenager, and never forgotten. The Bach flowed from his fingers with surprising ease, muscle memory overriding months of neglect. But as he played, Julian began to understand what the old man had shown him, that music wasn't just about technical accuracy or even emotional expression. It was about creating a space where time could slow down, where the urgent demands of daily life could be held at bay, where the soul could remember what it felt like to be still. The small audience in the tea room listened with the same reverent attention they had given to the previous player. There was no judgment here, no expectation of perfection. The room itself seemed to absorb the music, to hold it gently and reflect it back, enriched by all the music that had come before. Julian moved from the Bach into something of his own, not a complete composition, but a musical idea he had been carrying in his head for weeks without quite knowing what to do with it. Under his fingers, it became a conversation between melody and harmony, between what was and what might be, between memory and possibility. As he played, he became aware of the sounds surrounding the music, the gentle clink of china as teacups were washed and dried, the soft whisper of pages turning, the barely audible conversations of the other patrons, the distant sound of water lapping against stone foundations. All of these sounds wove together with his music, creating a symphony of everyday beauty that felt more profound than any concert hall performance he had ever attended. The improvisation came to a natural conclusion, and Julian let his hands rest on the keys for a moment, feeling the instrument's vibrations settle into silence. When he looked up, he saw the woman behind the counter, watching him with the same gentle smile she had worn all evening. She nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed approval, welcome, and understanding all at once. He returned to his table, to his cooling tea, and the view of the narrow alley where street lamps now cast golden pools on ancient stones. The evening had deepened into true night, and Venice had transformed once again, becoming a city of shadows and reflected light, of whispered conversations and distant music drifting from unseen windows. Other patrons began to gather their things, to prepare for the transition back to the world outside this sanctuary. But they moved slowly, reluctantly, like people leaving a warm pier on a cold night. The room had worked its magic on all of them, had reminded them of something they had forgotten they were missing. Julian realized that he didn't want to leave either, not just because the room was beautiful, or because the tea was perfect, or because the piano had welcomed him like an old friend. He didn't want to leave because for the first time in months, he felt like himself again, not the man who had been defined by divorce papers and professional obligations, and the careful architecture of a life rebuilt from ruins, but the person who had fallen in love with music as a child, who had once believed that beauty was reason enough for anything. As the other patrons departed, each one nodding goodbye to the woman behind the counter, as if ending a conversation with an old friend. Julian found himself alone in the room, except for his gentle hostess. She continued her closing rituals, but with no sense of hurry or impatience. The candles continued to flicker. The lamps continued to cast their warm glow, and the piano continued to hold its patient silence. Outside, Venice was settling into its nighttime rhythm. The tourist crowds had dispersed. The restaurants were beginning to close, and the city was returning to its residents. The people who knew it not as a destination, but as home. Occasionally, footsteps would echo past the window, or voices would drift by speaking in rapid Italian. But these sounds only emphasized the peace within the tea room. Julian finished his second cup of tea and realized that he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. A complete absence of the need to be anywhere else. Not the resignation of someone who had given up on having somewhere better to go, but the contentment of someone who had found exactly where they needed to be, even if they hadn't known they were looking for it. The woman approached his table with the check, written in careful script on paper that matched the room's vintage character. But when Julian looked at the amount, he was surprised by how little it was. Barely more than he would have paid for a single cup of coffee in Dublin. He looked up at her questioningly, and she simply shrugged with the kind of smile that suggested money was not the most important currency in this place. As Julian prepared to leave, the woman handed him a small card. Not a business card, but something more personal. It was cream-colored paper, thick and expensive feeling, with the tea room's name written in the same elegant script as the sign outside. On the back, in pencil, were the hours daily, 3 p.m. to 10 p.m., except Sundays. Below that, also in pencil, were the words, La musica è sempre benvenuta. Music is always welcome. He tucked the card into his jacket pocket, next to his heart, and shook the woman's hand. Her grip was warm and firm, the handshake of someone who had spent decades welcoming strangers and somehow making them feel like old friends. She walked him to the door, turning the sign to Chiuso, closed, but her gesture suggested that the closing was temporary, that tomorrow would bring new music, new tea, new opportunities for the kind of peace he had found tonight. Outside, the October air carried the familiar scent of Venice at night, salt and stone, old wood, and something indefinably romantic that might have been the accumulated dreams of centuries of lovers and artists and wanderers who had walked these same streets. Julian stood for a moment in the narrow alley, looking back at the warm glow emanating from the tea room's windows, committing the sight to memory. He began to walk back toward his hotel, but his steps were slower now, more measured. There was no urgency in his movement, no anxiety about tomorrow or regret about yesterday. Venice welcomed night wanderers, and he let himself be one of them, following the maze of streets and bridges without consulting a map, trusting the city to eventually lead him home. As he walked, Julian became aware that the music from the tea room was still with him, not as memory, but as something more present. The rhythm of his footsteps on the stone bridges seemed to echo the gentle tempo of the pieces he had played and heard. The sound of water against stone provided a bass line, and the distant voices and laughter from apartments above created a melody that wove through the night air like incense. He realized that what he had found in the Sala di Te e Musica was not just a respite from his troubles, but a reminder of something fundamental, that beauty exists not as escape from life, but as one of life's most essential elements. The room had not solved his problems or answered his questions about the future, but it had reminded him that questions don't always need immediate answers, that sometimes the most important thing is simply to be present in the moment, to be open to whatever gifts the present might offer. The bridges and alleys of Venice guided him gently through the night, each turn revealing new perspectives on familiar beauty. The moon, nearly full, cast silver paths across the dark water of the canals, and the reflections of street lamps wavered like liquid gold on the surface. It was a city designed for contemplation, for the kind of walking that is really a form of meditation, for the discovery of beauty in unexpected places. Back in his hotel room, Julian sat by the window that looked out over a small canal. The sounds of the city at night drifted up to him, the distant hum of conversation from a late-night restaurant, the gentle splash of water, taxi engines, the soft sound of shutters being closed against the night air. But underneath all of these sounds, he could still hear the music from the tea room, as if it had become part of the city's permanent soundtrack. He opened his journal, the same one he had carried from Dublin, filled with half-finished thoughts and fragments of music that had seemed important at the time, but had never quite cohered into anything complete. But tonight, instead of writing about his confusion, or his loneliness, or his uncertainty about the future, he found himself describing the tea room, trying to capture in words the feeling of peace he had discovered there. The description grew longer than he had intended, filling several pages with details about the lighting, the music, the taste of tea, the feeling of finding exactly the right place at exactly the right time. As he wrote, he realized that he was not just recording the experience, but somehow extending it, keeping alive the sense of possibility and beauty that the evening had awakened in him. When he finally set the journal aside and prepared for sleep, Julian felt something he hadn't experienced in months: anticipation for tomorrow. Not because he had specific plans or expectations, but because the day ahead felt full of potential, as if Venice might have other gifts to offer, other opportunities for the kind of unexpected joy he had stumbled upon in the music tea room. As sleep approached, Julian's mind drifted back to the piano in the tea room. to the feeling of music flowing through his hands without effort or strain. In that drowsy space between waking and sleeping, he could almost hear the Steinway calling to him, promising that it would be there tomorrow, patient and welcoming, ready to transform whatever emotions he brought to it into something beautiful and shared. The sounds of Venice at night became a lullaby, water lapping against stone, the distant echo of footsteps on bridges, the soft closing of shutters, the whispered conversations of people walking home through the maze of alleys and squares. It was a city that understood the value of gentleness, of taking time, of finding beauty in the everyday details that hurried people so often missed. And somewhere in that gentle transition from consciousness to dream, Julian realized that he had found something in Venice that he hadn't even known he was looking for. Not just peace, but the reminder that peace was possible, that beauty was always available to those who knew how to look for it, that music was not just a profession or a hobby, but a way of being in the world with openness and wonder. The last thing he remembered before sleep claimed him completely was the feeling of the piano keys beneath his fingers, the warmth of the room around him, and the promise of tomorrow's return to the place where music and tea and gentle kindness created a sanctuary in the heart of one of the world's most beautiful cities. In his dreams, the music continued, flowing like water through the canals of Venice, connecting every bridge and building and heart in a symphony of shared humanity, reminding anyone who listened that beauty and peace were not luxuries, but necessities, as essential as breath, as natural as the tide that had shaped this floating city across centuries of moonlit nights. And in that dream, the tea room remained open always, its warm light glowing in the darkness, its piano waiting patiently for the next wanderer who needed to remember that they were not alone in the world, that somewhere in a small room filled with music and kindness, there would always be a place to rest, to listen, to remember what it felt like to be beautifully, peacefully, completely alive. Sleep well, dear listener. Let the music of Venice carry you gently into dreams, where pianos wait in rooms filled with golden light, where tea tastes of comfort and possibility, where every note you play echoes with the beauty of being exactly where you need to be.